The empire had changed hands, but the old man remained. Where once the golden lions of Babylon had adorned palace walls and the great processional way had echoed with hymns to Marduk, now Persian banners flew and the name of Ahura Mazda was spoken in the corridors of power. Cyrus the Great, King of Kings, ruler of the four corners of the earth, had swept into Babylon without a battle, fulfilling prophecies that the aged advisor in his court had known for decades would come to pass. The year was 536 BCE, the third year of Cyrus's reign over Babylon, and Daniel, son of Joachim, taken captive as a teenager nearly 70 years before, still walked the halls where he had served kings whose bones now lay in the royal tombs. He was somewhere in his 80s now, this Hebrew prophet who had outlived empires. His hair had long since turned white, his steps had grown measured and careful, his eyes had witnessed more than any man should have to see. Yet those eyes remained sharp, that mind remained clear, and the God he had served since his youth in Jerusalem had not released him from prophetic service. Daniel had expected to die in Babylon. He had made his peace with that reality decades ago. What he had not expected was to still be standing when Babylon itself died, when the empire that had carried him into exile crumbled in a single night of feasting and terror, when the handwriting on the wall that he alone could read announced the end of an age. The memories stretched back across the long decades like a road disappearing into morning mist. He had been perhaps 15 or 16 when the Babylonian soldiers came in the first wave of deportations during the reign of Jehoiakim. Nebuchadnezzar, that ambitious young crown prince, who would soon become the greatest king Babylon had ever known, had selected the finest of Judah's youth for service in his court, young men of noble blood, without physical defect, handsome, intelligent, quick to learn. Daniel remembered the journey east, remembered the first sight of Babylon's walls rising from the Mesopotamian plain like something from a fever dream, remembered the moment when foreign officials assigned him a new name and a new identity and expected him to forget everything he had been. They called him Belteshazzar, a name honouring the Babylonian god Bel, but in his heart he remained Daniel, a name that meant God is my judge. That private act of identity preservation had been the first of countless quiet resistances, small faithfulnesses that accumulated across decades into a life of unwavering devotion. He had refused the royal food that violated his dietary laws. He had prayed 3 times daily toward Jerusalem even when it meant the lion's den. He had spoken truth to power even when power held his life in its hands, and somehow, improbably, miraculously, he had survived. More than survived, he had flourished, rising to positions of influence that no exile should have attained, interpreting dreams and visions that shaped the course of empires. Nebuchadnezzar had been the first, that towering figure whose golden image haunted Daniel's prophetic imagination, whose pride had driven him to madness, and whose humiliation had eventually brought him to acknowledge the Most High God. Daniel had watched that transformation with wonder, had seen the mightiest king on earth reduced to eating grass like an animal, and then restored to sanity and throne, had heard from Nebuchadnezzar's own lips the confession that the God of Israel ruled over all kingdoms of men. It had been a strange relationship, prophet and pagan king, yet something like genuine respect had grown between them over the decades. After Nebuchadnezzar came lesser men. His son Belshazzar had inherited the throne without inheriting his father's eventual wisdom, and Daniel had watched him feast and blaspheme on the very night Babylon fell, drinking wine from vessels looted from Jerusalem's temple, while Persian soldiers crept through channels beneath the city walls. The handwriting had appeared on the plaster, those terrible words that none of the Babylonian wise men could read. Mene, Mene, Tekel, Parsia, numbered, weighed, divided. Before morning, Belshazzar was dead and the Babylonian Empire was a memory. Darius the Mede had come next, that shadowy figure whom historians would later struggle to identify, who ruled Babylon as Cyrus consolidated his conquest. It was under Darius that Daniel had faced the lion's den, betrayed by jealous officials who could find no corruption in his conduct, and so attacked his faithfulness to his God instead. Daniel remembered the stone rolled over the den's mouth, remembered the long nights surrounded by predators whose jaws remained inexplicably closed, remembered the morning when the king's voice called down, asking if his God had been able to deliver him. The scars where lion claws had grazed but not torn still marked his aged skin, testimonies written in flesh to divine protection. And now Cyrus, the Persian conqueror whom Isaiah had named 2 centuries before he was born, whom Scripture called God's anointed shepherd, whose decree had opened the way for exiles to return to Jerusalem and rebuild the temple. Daniel had lived long enough to see prophecy become history, to witness the fulfillment of what Jeremiah had foretold about 70 years of exile coming to an end. The graves were opening just as Ezekiel had envisioned. The dry bones of Israel were beginning to stir. But Daniel himself had not joined the returning exiles. When Zerubbabel led the first wave back to Judah, when Joshua the high priest accompanied them to re-establish the sacrificial system, when families packed their belongings and turned their faces toward the land of their ancestors, Daniel remained in Babylon. Perhaps he was too old for the arduous journey across the desert. Perhaps his position in the Persian court was too valuable to abandon, a continuing voice for his people at the center of imperial power. Perhaps God had simply not released him, had kept him in place for purposes that the old prophet did not fully understand. Whatever the reason, Daniel found himself in the strange position of having prayed his entire life for a restoration he would likely never participate in. Every day for nearly 7 decades, he had opened his windows toward Jerusalem and petitioned the God of his fathers for the rebuilding of the holy city, the restoration of the temple, the return of the exiles to their inheritance. Now those prayers were being answered, and he remained in Mesopotamia, watching from a distance as others walked the road home. The loneliness of this was profound, though Daniel bore it with the same quiet dignity that had characterized his entire life. He had outlived his contemporaries, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, the 3 friends who had stood with him in the fiery furnace, who had shared his exile and his faith through all the long years. Whether they had died in Babylon or returned to Judah in their old age, the scriptures do not say, but by the 3rd year of Cyrus, Daniel appears alone in the narrative, a solitary figure carrying memories that no one else could share. His nights were often wakeful now, as the nights of the elderly tend to be, and in those quiet hours Daniel's mind wandered through the vast landscape of what he had witnessed. The statue in Nebuchadnezzar's dream, with its head of gold and feet of iron mixed with clay, empires succeeding empires until a stone cut without hands shattered them all. The 4 beasts rising from the sea, terrible and magnificent, until the Ancient of Days took his seat, and one like a son of man approached the throne on clouds of heaven. The ram and the goat, Persia and Greece, powers yet to clash in conflicts Daniel would not live to see. The 70 weeks of years, that mysterious calculation pointing toward an anointed one who would be cut off, toward a decree to restore Jerusalem, toward events that seemed to shimmer at the edge of comprehension. These visions had cost him. Each encounter with divine revelation had left Daniel physically depleted, sometimes for days afterward. The human frame was not designed to bear the weight of heavenly communication, and even a prophet strengthened by decades of faithfulness felt the strain of peering beyond the veil that separates mortal existence from eternal truth. Daniel had been sick after the vision of the ram and goat, appalled and exhausted and unable to function normally for some time. He had learned that to see what God reveals is a privilege that comes at a price, yet the visions kept coming, and Daniel kept receiving them, because this was what he had been made for, what he had been preserved for, what all the lions' dens and fiery furnaces and imperial upheavals had been pointing toward. He was a vessel for divine communication, a channel through which knowledge of the future flowed into the present, and he would fulfill that function until the breath left his body. Reports reached him from Jerusalem, carried by travelers and merchants and the efficient communication networks of the Persian Empire. The returning exiles had laid the foundation of the new temple, but the work had stalled. Opposition from local populations, discouragement among the builders, the sheer difficulty of rebuilding from ruins, all of this had slowed the restoration to a crawl. The joyful departure had given way to grinding difficulty. The prophesied return had become a daily struggle. Those who had expected swift restoration found themselves facing years, perhaps decades, of patient labour against persistent resistance. Daniel heard these reports and felt them in his bones. He could not lift stones in Jerusalem, could not stand guard against enemies of the work, could not encourage the discouraged labourers with his physical presence. but he could pray. He had always been able to pray, and so the old prophet who had once interpreted the dreams of kings now poured out his heart for a city he would never see again, for a temple he would never enter, for a people he loved with a fierce and undying devotion. The days grew long in the 3rd year of Cyrus, and Daniel felt an urgency building within him, a sense that something was approaching, that the God who had spoken so many times before was preparing to speak again. He did not know what form the revelation would take or what truths it would contain. He knew only that after a lifetime of faithful service, after decades of visions and interpretations and miraculous deliverances, he stood on the threshold of something new. There was a weight in the air, a heaviness that Daniel had learned to recognize over the years, the atmospheric pressure that preceded divine encounter. The spiritual realm was stirring. Forces beyond human perception were moving into position. The old prophet could sense it the way a sailor senses a storm beyond the horizon, the way a shepherd senses the wolf before it appears. Something was coming, and it was coming for him. His thoughts turned often now to the end, not with fear, but with a kind of quiet anticipation. He had lived longer than he had ever expected, had seen more than he had ever imagined, had been preserved through dangers that should have claimed his life a dozen times over. Whatever years remained to him were borrowed time, grace upon grace from a God who had never abandoned him. If death came tomorrow, Daniel could meet it with clear conscience. He had kept the faith. He had finished the race that was set before him. He had remained Daniel, God is my judge, from the first day of exile to whatever day would be his last. But before the end, there was still one more vision to receive, one more revelation to bear, one more message to record for generations yet unborn. The old prophet who had faced Nebuchadnezzar's rage and Belshazzar's foolishness and Darius's helpless anguish, who had stood before lions and walked with kings and outlived empires, began to prepare himself in the only way he knew. He turned away from comfort. He turned toward God. He entered into a season of mourning and fasting that would last 21 days, and at the end of those days, he would encounter a figure so overwhelming that all his previous visions would seem like shadows cast by an approaching light. The man in linen was coming, and Daniel, old and weary and wise beyond measure, would need every ounce of strength that remained in his aged frame to receive what heaven was about to reveal. The fast began in the first month of the Hebrew calendar, the month of Nisan, when spring softened the Mesopotamian plains and the anniversary of Passover stirred ancient memories in every Jewish heart. It was the season when Israel had once walked free from Egypt, when the blood of lambs on doorposts had turned aside the angel of death, when a nation of slaves had become a people chosen for divine purpose. Now, in a foreign land, an old prophet marked the season not with celebration but with mourning, turning away from every comfort as he turned his face toward God. Daniel set aside the rich foods that Persian court life made available. No meat crossed his lips during those 21 days, no wine touched his tongue, no pleasant bread satisfied his hunger. He ate only what was necessary to sustain life, simple fare, unadorned, barely enough to keep an aged body functioning. The luxurious oils that Babylonians and Persians used to soften skin and perfume the body remained untouched in their vessels. Daniel let himself become gaunt, unwashed in the ceremonial sense, stripped of every physical pleasure that might distract from the business of the soul. This was not mere religious ritual. This was not the external performance of piety designed to impress observers. Daniel fasted because his heart was breaking, and broken hearts have no appetite for feasting. The reports from Jerusalem had pierced him more deeply than he allowed anyone to see. His people had returned to the land of promise only to find it a land of opposition, of rubble, of dreams deferred and hopes frustrated. The temple foundation lay exposed to the elements, work having ceased under pressure from enemies who wanted no Jewish restoration in their midst. The exiles who had journeyed home with such expectation now faced the grinding reality of rebuilding from nothing, while hostile neighbours schemed against them. Daniel could see, with the clarity that age and experience provide, how easily the restoration could fail. The returning exiles were few compared to those who remained scattered throughout the Persian Empire. They were poor, having left behind whatever prosperity they had built in Babylon. They were vulnerable, surrounded by peoples who viewed their return as a threat. The Persian court that had authorized their return could just as easily authorize their expulsion if political winds shifted. Everything that Daniel had prayed for across 7 decades hung in a precarious balance, and he could do nothing to tip that balance except pray. So he prayed. He mourned. He fasted. He made himself low before the God who held all futures in his hands. The physical toll of such extended fasting on an elderly body was significant. Daniel felt his strength ebbing as the days accumulated, felt the lightness in his head that comes from sustained denial of nourishment, felt his aged muscles growing weaker as they consumed themselves for fuel. Sleep came in fragments, interrupted by prayer, by weeping, by the kind of spiritual wrestling that leaves a person exhausted without providing rest. The nights were long, the days were longer, and the silence of heaven pressed against Daniel like a weight he could barely bear. For heaven was silent. That was perhaps the hardest part of those 3 weeks. Daniel poured out his heart day after day, petition after petition, and received no answer. No vision came, no angelic messenger appeared, no divine voice broke through the stillness to assure him that his prayers were heard. The God who had spoken so dramatically throughout Daniel's life, through dreams and visions, through handwriting on walls, through the mouths of lions held shut, now seemed distant, absent, unreachable. This silence was its own kind of trial. Daniel had experienced divine communication often enough to know that God was not obligated to respond on human timelines. He had learned that faith means trusting when you cannot see, believing when you do not hear, persisting when every natural inclination urges you to stop. But knowing this theologically and experiencing it existentially were different things. The old prophet who had stood before kings without trembling now knelt in his private chambers and wondered if his prayers rose any higher than the ceiling. Yet he continued. This was the essence of Daniel's character, forged across a lifetime of faithful endurance. He did not pray because prayer always produced immediate results. He prayed because prayer was right, because his people needed intercession, because the God he served was worthy of petition, regardless of whether answers came quickly or slowly, or not at all within Daniel's lifetime. The discipline of decades held him steady when emotion might have driven him to despair. He had opened his windows toward Jerusalem 3 times daily for nearly 70 years. He would not stop now simply because heaven seemed silent. The other Jews in the Persian court must have noticed the change in him. Daniel's position required public appearances, official functions, the maintenance of relationships that kept him useful to the empire and thus useful to his people. But during these 3 weeks, he withdrew as much as his duties permitted. Those who saw him would have observed the gauntness of extended fasting, the weariness around his eyes, the distractions of a mind occupied with matters far beyond the concerns of imperial administration. Some perhaps attributed it to his age, an old man slowing down, beginning the long decline toward death. They did not understand that Daniel was not declining but preparing, not weakening but making space for a strength that was not his own. In his solitude, Daniel's mind ranged across the visions he had received in years past, searching for connections, for patterns, for understanding. The 70 weeks that Gabriel had revealed to him, what did they mean for the exiles now struggling in Jerusalem? The kingdoms that would rise and fall, the conflicts that would shake the earth, the abomination that would stand where it should not. How did these fit together? The pieces were in his possession, but the complete picture remained obscured, like a mosaic viewed too closely to perceive the whole design. He thought often of Jeremiah's prophecy, the 70 years of exile that had governed his prayers for so long. Those years had ended, Cyrus had come, the decree had been issued, but the fulfillment seemed so much messier than the promise had suggested. Return had not meant immediate restoration. The end of exile had not meant the end of struggle. Daniel was learning in his old age that prophetic fulfillment often arrives in forms that look nothing like what imagination anticipated. God keeps his promises, but he keeps them in his own way, according to his own purposes, on his own timeline. The second week of fasting gave way to the third, and Daniel's body reached the limits of what it could endure. He continued taking minimal nourishment, just enough to remain alive, but his strength had departed almost entirely. Rising from his knees required effort. Walking required concentration. The simple acts of daily existence had become labours, yet something was shifting in the spiritual atmosphere around him, something he could sense without being able to name. The silence that had pressed so heavily was becoming charged, pregnant with approaching revelation. Daniel recognized the signs. He had experienced this before, this gathering of spiritual pressure before the breaking through of divine communication. It was like the stillness before a thunderstorm, when the air grows heavy and electric and every living creature senses that something is about to happen. Heaven had heard his prayers. Heaven was responding. But the response was taking time to arrive, working its way through resistance that Daniel did not yet understand, fighting battles in realms invisible to human eyes. On the 24th day of the first month, the fast having ended 3 days prior, Daniel found himself by the banks of the great river. The Tigris flowed broad and strong past the city, its waters carrying the snowmelt of distant mountains toward the Persian Gulf. The location was significant, though Daniel may not have chosen it consciously. Rivers had featured in Jewish experience of the divine before: the Kibar Canal, where Ezekiel saw his visions, the Jordan, where Israel crossed into the Promised Land, the Nile, where Moses was preserved and later turned to blood. Something about moving water, that ancient symbol of life and boundary and passage, seemed to attract the presence of God. The Tigris itself held layers of meaning for anyone steeped in Hebrew scripture. It was one of the 4 rivers that flowed from Eden in the beginning, named in Genesis alongside the Euphrates as marking the boundaries of paradise. To stand by the Tigris was to stand at a location that connected the present moment to the very origins of human history, to the garden where God walked with Adam in the cool of the day, to the world before sin and exile and death had entered. Daniel, an exile from his own land, stood by a river that flowed from the memory of the first home humanity had ever lost. The spring sunlight fell warm on the prophet's shoulders, a gentle contrast to the austerity of the weeks just ended. The breeze carried the scent of water and green things growing, the smell of life renewing itself after winter's dormancy. Daniel's body remained weak from the extended fast, but his spirit had begun to recover, nourished by resumed eating and by the simple goodness of being outdoors in pleasant weather. For a few moments, perhaps, he allowed himself to simply exist, to breathe, to feel the sun and wind on skin that had been confined to darkened rooms of mourning. Daniel was not alone. Companions travelled with him, fellow Jews perhaps, or Persian officials who attended a man of his rank. The text does not identify them, leaving them anonymous figures at the edge of a story that was about to become intensely personal. They walked along the riverbank, perhaps conducting business, perhaps simply enjoying the spring air after the long confinement of Daniel's mourning period. Nothing in the ordinary activities of the moment suggested that the heavens were about to open. Nothing warned them that they walked on ground that was about to become holy. The transition from ordinary to extraordinary came without prelude, without warning, without the gradual building of signs that might have prepared them for what was to come. One moment the world was normal: sunlight, water, breeze, conversation. The next moment normalcy shattered like thin ice beneath sudden weight, and then Daniel lifted his eyes, and everything changed. The others saw nothing, or rather, they saw nothing distinct, nothing that their minds could process into recognizable form. But they felt something, a terror that gripped them without explanation, a dread that sent them fleeing for cover, hiding among rocks and vegetation, desperate to escape a presence they could not perceive but could not deny. One moment they were walking with Daniel, the next moment they were gone, scattered like leaves before a wind they could not see, driven by instincts older than a rational thought, running from something their conscious minds refused to acknowledge. This phenomenon, companion sensing divine presence without seeing its form, had precedent in biblical history. When God spoke to young Samuel in the temple, only Samuel heard the voice. When the risen Christ appeared on the Damascus road, Paul's companions saw the light but could not make out the figure within it. The ability to perceive divine manifestation fully seems to be given selectively, to those whom God chooses as recipients of revelation, while others nearby receive only enough awareness to know that something beyond their comprehension has invaded ordinary space. Daniel alone remained. Daniel alone saw what had appeared before him. And what he saw drove every remaining trace of strength from his aged body, collapsing him to the ground in a heap of trembling flesh and overwhelmed spirit. The man who had stood before Nebuchadnezzar without flinching, who had read judgment on Belshazzar's wall without trembling, who had survived a night among lions with perfect composure, now lay prostrate in the dirt, undone by a single glimpse of what heaven had sent. The 21 days of silence had ended. Heaven had broken through. And standing before the old prophet was a figure so terrible and beautiful that Daniel would struggle to find words adequate to describe what his eyes beheld. The man in linen had arrived. What Daniel saw defied the categories of ordinary perception. His eyes registered details, his mind attempted to process them, his memory would later struggle to find words adequate to convey what those few moments contained. He was looking at a figure in human form, a man, the text says, using the Hebrew word ish. But everything about this man exceeded the boundaries of what human means. This was humanity glorified, humanity perfected, humanity blazing with a radiance that belonged to realms beyond the mortal world. The figure was clothed in linen. This detail came first, perhaps because it was the most recognizable, the most connected to Daniel's frame of reference. Linen was the fabric of priests, the material prescribed for those who served in the temple, the cloth worn by the high priest when he entered the Holy of Holies on the Day of Atonement. To see a figure clothed in linen was to see someone dressed for sacred service, someone whose very garments spoke of purity and consecration. But this was no ordinary priest. This was something else entirely, wearing the vestments of holiness while radiating a glory that would have consumed any earthly sanctuary. Around the figure's waist was a belt of gold, not gold thread woven into fabric, not gold ornament attached to cloth, but gold itself from Uphaz, a region renowned for producing the purest and most precious gold known to the ancient world. The belt girded the linen robe with material worth a king's ransom, binding the priestly garment with royal wealth, combining the imagery of sacred service with sovereign power. Whoever this figure was, he united in his person the offices of priest and king, the one who serves before God and the one who rules over nations. But it was the figure's body itself that overwhelmed Daniel's capacity to observe. The man's skin appeared like chrysolite, that yellow-green gemstone prized throughout the ancient world, as if flesh had been replaced by precious stone, as if the body were not organic matter, but crystallized light given human form. He seemed to glow from within, translucent and luminous, solid yet somehow beyond solidity, present in physical space yet clearly not bound by physical limitations. The face was impossible to look upon directly. Daniel would describe it as lightning, not like lightning, but lightning itself, as though the figure's countenance was composed of the same brilliant, terrifying energy that splits the sky during storms. Every attempt to focus on the features was defeated by radiance too intense for human eyes to sustain. The face was there, was real, was presumably beautiful beyond description, but its beauty came wrapped in overwhelming power that drove the observer's gaze away, even as it drew the observer's soul forward. The eyes burned. Like torches, Daniel would say, like flames of fire. These were not metaphors straining toward description, but the closest approximation language could offer to something that transcended language. Those eyes held knowledge that spanned ages, compassion that embraced worlds, authority that commanded armies visible and invisible. To meet those eyes, even for an instant, was to be seen completely, known utterly, laid bare before a perception that missed nothing and forgot nothing. Daniel felt those burning eyes upon him and understood, in a way that bypassed rational thought, that this figure knew everything about him, every prayer, every doubt, every faithful act, every hidden failure, and regarded him still with something that could only be called love. The arms and legs shared the quality of the skin but intensified it, gleaming like polished bronze that had been heated until it glowed. The imagery suggested both beauty and danger, both craftsmanship and fire, both the refined product of skilled metalwork and the raw heat of the furnace that produced it. This figure was beautiful the way a forge is beautiful, the way a lightning strike is beautiful, the way the sun itself is beautiful. Terrible, magnificent, not safe to approach yet impossible to ignore. And then the figure spoke, and Daniel discovered that the visual overwhelm had been merely preparation. The voice came not as a single sound, but as a multitude, as though a vast crowd spoke in perfect unison, as though an army called out with one breath, as though the waters of many rivers merged into a single torrent of sound. Daniel would use the Hebrew word hamon, the noise of a multitude, the roar of tumult, the sound of abundance beyond counting. It was not loud in the way thunder is loud, not piercing in the way a trumpet is piercing. It was encompassing, surrounding, filling every space the way water fills a vessel, leaving no corner of awareness untouched by its resonance. The words themselves, whatever the figure said in that first moment of speaking, barely registered in Daniel's consciousness. The sound was too overwhelming for content to penetrate. Later, the message would come through clearly, but in this initial encounter, Daniel was drowning in the sheer fact of divine communication, unable to process meaning while being engulfed by presence. His body failed completely. Whatever strength remained after 3 weeks of fasting, whatever composure decades of faithful service had developed, whatever dignity an advisor to kings might maintain under pressure, all of it collapsed in an instant. Daniel's face struck the ground as his legs gave way beneath him, his consciousness contracting to a single point of awareness surrounded by spinning darkness. He was not asleep, not unconscious in the ordinary sense, but he was also not awake in any way that the word usually implies. He existed in a space between states, overwhelmed beyond the capacity of his aged frame to process, prostrate before a glory that no human being could behold and remain standing. The deep sleep that fell upon him was reminiscent of the sleep God caused to fall on Adam before creating Eve, the sleep that came upon Abraham before the covenant of the pieces, the supernatural suspension of normal consciousness that preceded divine action throughout biblical history. Daniel lay face down in the dirt beside the Tigris, an old man broken by beauty, shattered by holiness, undone by an encounter that exceeded anything his decades of prophetic experience had prepared him for. How long he remained in that state the text does not say. Time loses meaning in such moments. What may have been seconds could have felt like hours. What may have been hours could have felt like seconds. The normal flow of temporal experience had been interrupted by the intrusion of the eternal, and Daniel existed outside the framework that usually structures human perception of duration. Then came the touch. A hand reached down and made contact with the prostrate prophet, and the touch itself carried power. Daniel felt himself being moved, being lifted, not to his feet but to his hands and knees, raised from complete collapse to partial recovery. His face came up from the dirt. His arms braced against the ground. He trembled violently, every limb shaking with the after-effects of what he had witnessed, but he was no longer flat on his face. Something had changed. The touch had communicated strength, not enough to stand but enough to rise to all fours, enough to lift his head, enough to prepare to receive what was about to be communicated. A voice spoke again, and this time the words penetrated. "Daniel, you who are highly esteemed, consider carefully the words I am about to speak to you, and stand up, for I have now been sent to you." The address was extraordinary. The heavenly messenger identified Daniel by name, not by his Babylonian name Belteshazzar, but by his Hebrew name, his true name, the name that meant God is my judge. And more than that, he identified him by his standing in heaven's estimation, highly esteemed, greatly beloved, precious in the sight of God. After 70 years of exile, after a lifetime of wondering if his faithfulness mattered, after 3 weeks of mourning with no apparent answer, Daniel heard from celestial lips that he was treasured, valued, beloved by the God he had served so long. The command to stand was gentle, but firm. The messenger had been sent, the passive voice indicating divine commission, and the business for which he had been sent required Daniel's attention, Daniel's consideration, Daniel's active engagement. The prophet could not remain on his hands and knees, trembling and overwhelmed. There was revelation to receive, prophecy to hear, truth to absorb, and eventually to record for generations yet unborn. Daniel rose to his feet, still trembling. The shaking would not stop entirely throughout the encounter, the physical manifestation of spiritual strain that his elderly body could not fully suppress. But he stood. He faced the figure before him. He prepared to listen. The messenger's next words began to explain the silence of the previous 3 weeks, pulling back a veil that Daniel had not even known existed, revealing a dimension of reality that would forever change how he understood the relationship between heaven and earth, between prayer and answer, between human petition and divine response. "Do not be afraid, Daniel," the figure continued, and the words carried comfort even as they introduced mysteries. "Since the first day that you set your mind to gain understanding and to humble yourself before your God, your words were heard, and I have come in response to them." The first day. Daniel's prayers had been heard from the very beginning. The 21 days of silence had not been divine indifference. They had not been heaven ignoring an old prophet's petitions. From day one, the response had been initiated. From the first moment of morning, the answer had been dispatched. Heaven had never been silent. Daniel simply had not yet received what heaven had sent. But if the response had been immediate, why had it taken 3 weeks to arrive? The messenger's next words opened a window into a realm of conflict that Daniel had only glimpsed in previous visions. A warfare waged beyond human perception, a struggle that shaped the destinies of nations while remaining invisible to those nations' inhabitants. Daniel stood on trembling legs, listening as the curtain between worlds drew back, preparing to learn that his prayers had triggered battles in heavenly places, that the silence he'd endured was not emptiness but war. The unseen realm was about to become visible, and what Daniel would learn would illuminate not only his present circumstances but the hidden architecture of all human history. The messenger's next words shattered assumptions that Daniel had not even known he held. For all his decades of prophetic experience, for all the visions of beasts and statues and heavenly thrones, the old prophet had never received so direct a glimpse into the workings of the spiritual realm, the invisible warfare that raged behind the visible events of human history. "The prince of the kingdom of Persia withstood me 21 days. The statement was simple, the implication staggering. The messenger had been dispatched the moment Daniel began to pray. Heaven's response had been immediate, instantaneous, as swift as the compassion of God for a faithful servant in distress. But between dispatch and arrival, between sending and receiving, lay a battleground that Daniel could not see. Something had opposed the messenger. Something had fought against him. Something had held him back for exactly the duration of Daniel's fast. 21 days of warfare corresponding to 21 days of silence. The Prince of Persia. Not Cyrus, the human emperor whose decrees governed the visible world. Not Darius or any other mortal ruler whose name appeared in official records. This was a prince of a different order, a spiritual entity of immense power whose dominion paralleled and influenced the earthly Persian Empire. Daniel was learning that behind the thrones of earthly kingdoms stood other thrones, invisible to human eyes but terrifyingly real, occupied by beings whose struggles shaped the course of nations without those nations ever knowing they were being shaped. This concept, sometimes called the Divine Council, or the Heavenly Host, ran throughout Hebrew scripture, though rarely with such explicit clarity. The sons of God who presented themselves before the Lord in Job, among whom the adversary also came. The host of heaven standing beside the throne that Micaiah the prophet saw, before predicting Ahab's defeat. The gods of the nations whom the psalmist addressed when declaring that YHWH judged among them. These scattered references had hinted at a reality that the messenger now described directly. A hierarchy of spiritual powers associated with earthly kingdoms, some aligned with God's purposes, others opposed, all engaged in conflicts that rippled through human experience without human awareness. The Prince of Persia had opposed the messenger. The nature of that opposition, whether active combat, territorial blocking, legal accusation before some heavenly tribunal, or something else entirely, the text does not specify. What it makes clear is that the opposition was real, was powerful, and required 21 days to overcome. Heaven's messenger, for all his terrifying glory, had not simply swept aside the resistance. He had been withstood, delayed, held back by a power significant enough to impede divine communication. Daniel's mind must have reeled as he absorbed this information. His prayers had mattered, that much was clear. But his prayers had not operated in a vacuum. They had entered a contested space, a realm where forces beyond human comprehension struggled for influence over earthly affairs. The silence Daniel had experienced was not divine neglect, but spiritual warfare, not absence of answer, but delay of delivery while battles raged in places he could not see. And then came the revelation that broke the stalemate. But Michael, one of the chief princes, came to help me, because I was detained there with the king of Persia. Michael. The name meant, "who is like God," and it belonged to one of the most powerful beings in the heavenly hierarchy. The messenger had needed reinforcement. The Prince of Persia had been strong enough to detain heaven's envoy until another warrior entered the fray, one identified as a chief prince, a commander among the armies of the Lord. Michael's intervention had shifted the balance, had broken the resistance, had freed the messenger to complete his journey to the old prophet trembling beside the Tigris. This was the first explicit mention of Michael in Scripture by name, though he would appear again, in the later portions of this very vision, in the epistle of Jude contending with the devil over Moses' body, in the revelation of John leading heaven's armies against the dragon. He was associated specifically with the protection of Israel, a guardian presence assigned to God's covenant people, their champion in the invisible conflicts that swirled around them. When the messenger could not break through alone, it was Israel's own celestial defender who came to turn the tide. The implications for understanding prayer began to unfold in Daniel's mind. When he knelt in his chamber and opened his windows toward Jerusalem, when he poured out his heart in petition and intercession, he was not merely speaking into empty air. His prayers ascended into a realm of active conflict, joining a struggle already in progress, adding their weight to a battle that would continue long after his voice fell silent. Prayer was not passive waiting for divine action. It was participation in cosmic war. And the war was not over. The messenger made this clear with his next words, extending Daniel's vision beyond the immediate moment into conflicts yet to come. "Now I must return to fight against the Prince of Persia, and when I go, the Prince of Greece will come." The present struggle with Persia would continue. The messenger's mission to Daniel was an interruption in ongoing warfare, a brief breaking away from combat to deliver a message before returning to the front lines. And beyond Persia lay Greece, another earthly empire with its own spiritual prince, another power center in the invisible realm that would rise as Persia declined. The geography of human politics found its mirror in the geography of heavenly conflict. As empires rose and fell on earth, corresponding powers rose and fell in the spiritual realm, an intricate dance of visible and invisible that shaped the destinies of nations. Daniel stood on trembling legs, trying to comprehend the scope of what he was hearing. He had known, of course, that God ruled over all kingdoms. He had proclaimed as much to Nebuchadnezzar, had declared it in the interpretation of dreams and the reading of handwriting on walls. But this was different. This was not simply divine sovereignty operating from an infinite distance, moving nations like pieces on a board. This was intimate, contested, dynamic. A sovereignty exercised through conflict, through the deployment of heavenly forces, through battles whose outcomes were not foregone conclusions but genuine struggles requiring courage and strength and strategic intervention. The messenger continued, offering Daniel a glimpse into the sources of prophetic authority. "No one supports me against them except Michael, your prince, and in the first year of Darius the Mede, I took my stand to support and protect him." The interconnections multiplied. The messenger and Michael had been working together not just in this present conflict, but in previous moments of historical significance. The first year of Darius the Mede, that was when Babylon fell, when the empire that had conquered Jerusalem collapsed in a single night, when Daniel read the handwriting on the wall, and Belshazzar died before dawn. Behind that political upheaval, the messenger now revealed, spiritual forces had been actively engaged, supporting and protecting, ensuring that the transition of empire served divine purposes, The fall of Babylon had been orchestrated not only by Persian armies, but by heavenly powers who took their stand at crucial moments of history. The phrase, "your prince," applied to Michael, carried profound significance for Daniel and for Israel. In a world where every nation seemed to have its spiritual representative, its invisible patron whose power paralleled its earthly fortunes, Israel was not without a defender. Michael stood for them, fought for them, represented their interests in councils and conflicts beyond human perception. The covenant people were not spiritual orphans, abandoned to the machinations of hostile powers. They had a prince of their own, one of the chief princes, mighty in the heavens, committed to their protection. This understanding cast new light on Israel's history and future. The exiles who had suffered under Babylon, who now struggled under Persia, who would eventually face Greece and Rome and countless other powers, they had never been truly alone. When it seemed that God had abandoned them, when empires crushed them and scattered them and attempted to erase their identity, Michael stood in the heavenly places contending for their survival. The visible defeats they experienced did not necessarily reflect invisible defeat. The spiritual warfare might be ongoing even when earthly circumstances looked hopeless. Daniel's trembling intensified as the weight of these revelations settled upon him. He was being granted a perspective that few mortals had ever received, a view from behind the curtain that separates ordinary experience from ultimate reality. The world he had navigated for 8 decades, the courts and councils and political maneuverings he had witnessed, the rise and fall of kings and kingdoms he had observed, all of it had been the surface manifestation of deeper conflicts, the visible foam on invisible waves, the earthly expression of heavenly struggles. And he, Daniel, standing in the intersection of these realms, was about to receive a vision that would map the future of those struggles, tracing the course of earthly empires and their spiritual counterparts across generations yet unborn. The messenger had one more piece of preliminary information to convey before the revelation proper began. "Now, I have come to explain to you what will happen to your people in the latter days, for the vision concerns a time yet to come. Your people, Israel, the covenant community for whom Daniel had prayed and fasted and mourned. The vision would not be abstract theology, not speculation about heavenly mechanics for their own sake. It would be about the fate of the people Daniel loved, the nation whose restoration he had sought with every prayer, the scattered exiles whose struggles had driven him to 3 weeks of mourning. Whatever battles raged in the heavens, their consequences would fall upon Israel in the days and years and centuries ahead." The spiritual warfare was not separate from human experience. It was determinative of human experience, shaping the sufferings and deliverances that God's people would undergo. The latter days. The phrase pointed beyond the immediate future, beyond the return from exile, beyond the rebuilding of the temple that so occupied Daniel's prayers. There was a larger arc of history in view, a span of time stretching toward a destination that the prophets called the Day of the Lord, the time of the end, the consummation of all things. Daniel's vision would reach across that entire span, touching empire after empire, conflict after conflict, until it arrived at events that still lay shrouded in mystery, even for interpreters millennia later. Daniel felt his strength failing again. The physical toll of the encounter had not diminished, and the overwhelming nature of what he was hearing added spiritual strain to bodily weakness. He would need to be strengthened again before the vision could continue, touched once more by heavenly power to sustain him through the revelations yet to come. But in this moment, poised between the explanation of heavenly warfare and the prophecy of earthly empires, he understood something that would anchor his faith for whatever remained of his life. Heaven was not indifferent. The silence of the 3 weeks had not been abandonment. The struggles of Israel were known, witnessed, contested by powers whose commitment to the covenant people matched God's own faithfulness. When Daniel prayed, things happened, not in some vague general sense, but specifically, consequentially, in the very halls of heavenly power where the fate of nations was determined. The messenger prepared to unfold the future, to trace the rise and fall of kingdoms from Persia to Greece and beyond, to reveal conflicts between powers that Daniel would never live to see clash. But first, the old prophet needed to recover enough strength to receive what was coming. The vision ahead would span centuries, It would require everything Daniel had left to give. He steadied himself as best he could. This aged servant who had witnessed so much and prepared to witness more. The heavens had opened. The warfare had been revealed. Now the history of the future awaited its telling. Before the vision could continue, Daniel's strength failed him again. The accumulation of overwhelming experience, the appearance of the figure, the collapse, the partial recovery, the revelation of heavenly warfare, had drained whatever reserves remained in his elderly frame. He found himself unable to speak, his lips sealed by weakness, his tongue heavy in his mouth. Even the capacity to respond to what he was hearing had been exhausted. The messenger noticed, and once again that strengthening touch came. A hand that appeared human but carried divine power reached out and made contact with Daniel's lips, loosening what had been bound, restoring what had been depleted. The old prophet felt words become possible again, felt his mouth open to speak, felt the capacity for communication return like circulation to a numbed limb. "My lord," Daniel managed, addressing the messenger with the respect due to a superior. "Because of the vision, anguish has come upon me, and I have retained no strength. How can your servant talk with you, my lord? My strength is gone and I can hardly breathe." The confession was complete, holding nothing back. Daniel did not pretend to strength he did not possess, did not maintain the dignity of an imperial advisor when dignity had been stripped away by divine encounter. He was empty, depleted, barely capable of drawing breath, let alone engaging in conversation with a being of such terrible glory. The gap between human frailty and heavenly power had never been more apparent. Yet again the messenger touched him, and yet again strength flowed through the contact. "Do not be afraid, you who are highly esteemed," the figure said. The title of honor repeated, the assurance of divine favor renewed. "Peace be with you. Be strong now. Be strong." The words carried performative power. They did not merely describe a state, but created it. As the messenger spoke peace, peace came. As he commanded strength, strength returned. Daniel felt his body stabilize, felt his mind clear, felt the capacity to receive revelation restored. He was still weak compared to his normal state, still trembling in the presence of overwhelming holiness, but he was functional again, capable of attending to what was about to be revealed. "Speak, my lord," Daniel said, "since you have given me strength." The messenger began to unfold the future like a scroll being unrolled, each section revealing another portion of the vast design. What followed was the most detailed prophetic vision in all of Hebrew scripture, a panorama of empires and conflicts spanning centuries, touching events that would not occur until long after Daniel's bones had returned to dust. The old prophet listened as history yet to happen passed before his understanding, kingdoms rising and falling like waves on a shore, each crest giving way to the next in an endless succession of human ambition and human failure. The vision began with Persia, the empire under which Daniel currently served. 3 more kings would arise after Cyrus, the messenger explained, and then a 4th who would be far richer than all the others. This wealthy king would use his resources to stir up conflict against the kingdom of Greece, initiating a clash between East and West that would reshape the ancient world. Later interpreters would identify these Persian kings with the successors of Cyrus, Cambyses, the false Smerdis, Darius thus, and the wealthy 4th king with Xerxes, whose massive invasion of Greece in 480 BCE would become legendary, the setting for Thermopylae and Salamis, for Spartan sacrifice and Athenian naval triumph. But Persia's attack on Greece would ultimately awaken a sleeping giant. The vision shifted westward to a mighty king who would arise and rule with great power, doing as he pleased. This king would expand with terrifying speed, conquering everything in his path, creating an empire larger than any the world had yet seen. Daniel did not need to be told that this pointed to Alexander of Macedon, the young warrior whose armies would sweep across Persia, Egypt, and beyond, reaching the borders of India before his soldiers refused to march further. The mighty king would shine like a comet across the night sky of history, brilliant, brief, unforgettable. And then, at the height of his power, the mighty king would be broken. His empire would be divided toward the 4 winds of heaven, split not among his descendants, but among his generals. parcelled out to those who had served him rather than those who shared his blood. The great kingdom that had seemed destined to last forever would fragment within a generation of its founding, its unity lasting no longer than the exceptional man who had created it. Alexander died at 32, and his empire died with him, carved into pieces by ambitious successors who spent decades fighting each other for the scraps. Daniel watched the vision unfold, seeing kingdoms rise and fall with a rapidity that made human ambition seem almost pathetic. All that striving, all that conquest, all that blood and treasure poured into the building of empires, and they crumbled so quickly, their glory fading almost before it had fully formed. The statue of Nebuchadnezzar's dream had shown this truth symbolically. Now Daniel was seeing it played out in specificity, name after name, conflict after conflict, each generation repeating the pattern of its predecessors. The messenger's account narrowed to focus on two of the fragments that emerged from Alexander's broken empire, the Kingdom of the South and the Kingdom of the North. These geographical designations corresponded to Egypt and Syria, to the dynasties founded by Ptolemy and Seleucus, two of Alexander's generals who carved out domains that would persist for centuries. Because the land of Israel lay directly between these two powers, caught in the geographical crossfire of their ambitions, their conflicts would shape Jewish experience for generations. What followed was a tapestry of intrigue so complex that later commentators would need detailed historical knowledge to trace each thread. The daughter of the king of the south would go to the king of the north to make an alliance, but she would not retain her position of power. She would be betrayed, handed over along with those who supported her. This pointed to Berenice, daughter of Ptolemy Themd, given in marriage to Antiochus II of Syria in a political arrangement that ended in her murder. A branch from her roots would arise, would attack the northern fortress, would carry off their gods and precious vessels to Egypt. This was Ptolemy III, avenging his sister by invading Syria and plundering its treasures. The vision continued, generation after generation, king after king. The sons of the north would prepare for war with vast armies. The king of the south would be stirred to battle and would overcome the northern multitude, but his victory would not last. The king of the north would return with a greater army than before, and many would rise against the king of the south. Even violent men among Daniel's own people would lift themselves up to fulfill the vision, but they would fall. Daniel listened to this cascade of conflicts, his aged heart heavy with what he heard. His people, the Jews of future generations, would be caught between these warring powers, sometimes allied with one, sometimes with the other, sometimes trampled by both. The land that God had promised as an inheritance would become a highway for armies, a prize to be won and lost and won again, its inhabitants treated as pawns in games played by foreign kings. The restoration that Daniel had prayed for, the return from exile that was just beginning in his own time, would not bring lasting peace. More suffering lay ahead, more conquest, more generations of his people living under foreign domination. The king of the north would come and build siege ramps and capture a fortified city. The forces of the south would not stand. Even their best troops would not have the strength to resist. The invader would do as he pleased, establishing himself in the beautiful land, Israel itself, with destruction in his hand. He would set his face to come with the strength of his whole kingdom, making alliances, giving daughters in marriage, attempting to overthrow through political manipulation what he could not seize through military force alone. Then that king would turn his attention to the coastlands, to the islands and coastal regions of the Mediterranean. He would take many of them, but a commander would put an end to his insolence, turning it back upon him. He would return to the fortresses of his own land, but would stumble and fall and be no more. His successor would send out a tax collector to maintain royal splendour, but within a few days that successor would be destroyed, though not in anger or battle. The precision of the prophecy was almost overwhelming. Each detail corresponded to events that historians would later document. The campaigns of Antiochus III, his conflict with Rome, the tax collector sent by Seleucus Thorpe into the temple treasury, the mysterious deaths that punctuated the Seleucid dynasty. Daniel was hearing the biography of kings who would not be born for centuries, the outcomes of battles whose participants did not yet exist, the rise and fall of rulers whose names would fill history books not yet written. And through it all, the theme remained constant. Kingdoms rise, kingdoms fall, and none endure. The Persians would give way to Greeks. The unified Greek Empire would fragment into warring successors. Those successors would exhaust themselves in generations of conflict, and eventually others would arise to replace them in turn. Human history was an endless churning of ambition and collapse, of glory grasped and glory lost, of empires that seemed eternal proving to be as temporary as morning mist. The emotional weight of this vision pressed upon Daniel with cumulative force. He had lived long enough to understand the pattern from personal experience. He had watched Babylon rise to unprecedented power and then fall in a single night. But seeing the pattern extended across centuries, seeing his people caught in the grinding mechanism of imperial conflict for generation after generation, filled him with a grief that transcended his individual circumstances. He was mourning not just for the exiles of his own time, but for the Jews of future ages, the descendants who would inherit the promises but also inherit the suffering. Yet even as the tapestry of warring kings unfolded, Daniel sensed that the vision was building towards something. The messenger was not merely cataloguing conflicts for their own sake. All this history, all these battles, all these kings of north and south locked in their endless struggle. It was all leading somewhere, pointing toward a figure who had not yet appeared in the narrative, a king darker and more terrible than any who had come before. The messenger's tone shifted slightly, the pace of the prophecy slowing as it approached its true focus. The succession of kings had been prologue. The wars between north and south had been context. Now came the figure around whom the vision would crystallize, the ruler whose actions would bring unprecedented suffering upon Daniel's people and whose end would mark a turning point in the ages. In his place shall arise a contemptible person, the messenger continued, and Daniel felt the temperature of the revelation drop, felt a shadow falling across the future that was deeper than any that had come before. The vision was about to enter its darkest chapter, and Daniel, sustained by touches of heavenly power, prepared to witness horrors that would test the faith of generations yet unborn. The contemptible person arose in the vision like a shadow-given form, a figure whose very description carried the weight of revulsion. He would not come to power through legitimate succession or noble conquest. Royal honour would not be conferred upon him through proper channels. Instead, he would seize the kingdom through intrigue, through manipulation, through the exploitation of a moment when defences were down and suspicions were lulled. He would come in peaceably, the messenger explained, and obtain the kingdom by flatteries, by smooth words and political manoeuvring rather than honest strength. Later generations would identify this figure primarily with Antiochus IV, Epiphanes, the Seleucid king who had ruled from 175 to 164 BCE, and whose persecution of the Jewish people would become legendary in its cruelty. The name Epiphanes meant God manifest, a title the king gave himself in his boundless arrogance. His enemies called him Epimanes instead, the madman, and history would vindicate their assessment. But as Daniel listened to the messenger's description, he sensed that the vision reached beyond any single historical figure, that Antiochus was a type, a pattern, a foreshadowing of something that would recur throughout history whenever pride and power combined to assault the people of God. The contemptible king would sweep away all before him, overwhelming opposition with flood-like force. Even a prince of the covenant would be destroyed, perhaps a reference to the legitimate high priest who would be murdered to make way for those willing to cooperate with the king's agenda. Alliances would be made and broken according to convenience. With a small number of people, the king would rise to power, entering the richest parts of provinces and doing what neither his fathers nor his forefathers had done, distributing plunder and wealth among his followers, buying loyalty with the spoils of conquest. His ambitions would turn southward, toward Egypt, and for a time success would attend his campaigns. Great armies would be stirred up, battles would be fought, and the king of the south would be overwhelmed. The two kings, north and south, would sit at the same table and speak lies to each other, each plotting the other's destruction while exchanging diplomatic pleasantries. But neither would prosper permanently, for the end would come at the appointed time, according to a schedule determined not by human ambition, but by divine decree. Then the vision darkened further. The king would return to his own land with great wealth, but his heart would be set against the Holy Covenant. He would take action against it before returning to his own territory. This was the turn that would transform a merely ambitious tyrant into an enemy of God's people specifically, a persecutor whose rage would focus on the destruction of Jewish faith and practice. Ships from the western coastlands would come against him, Rome, the rising power that even Seleucid kings could not ignore, and he would lose heart. Frustrated in his designs against Egypt, humiliated by Roman ultimatums, the king would redirect his fury toward an easier target. He would turn back and vent his rage against the Holy Covenant, showing favour to those who forsook it, rewarding apostates and collaborators while unleashing destruction upon the faithful. Armed forces would rise at his command and desecrate the temple fortress. They would abolish the daily sacrifice, the regular offerings that had continued for centuries, the rhythm of worship that connected each generation to its ancestors and to God. And in place of true worship, they would set up the abomination that causes desolation. Daniel felt the words like blows. The temple that was even now being rebuilt, the sanctuary for which he had prayed through decades of exile, would be desecrated again. The daily sacrifice that represented Israel's ongoing relationship with their God would be forcibly terminated. Something abominable would stand where holiness should reign, a desolation that would leave the faithful reeling in horror and confusion. The phrase would echo through Jewish memory for centuries, would be invoked by Jesus himself when warning of future tribulations, would become shorthand for the ultimate violation of sacred space. The persecution that followed would be comprehensive and calculated. With flattery, the king would corrupt those who had violated the covenant, drawing out collaborators who were willing to abandon their heritage for political advantage. But the people who knew their God would firmly resist him. They would stand strong, refusing to bow, choosing faithfulness over survival. The wise among the people would instruct many, teaching and encouraging and modelling resistance, though they would fall by sword and flame, by captivity and plunder for many days. This was the Maccabean period in embryo, the time of testing that would produce martyrs and heroes, that would see aged scribes tortured to death rather than eat forbidden food, that would watch mothers executed alongside the infant sons they had circumcised in defiance of royal decree. The messenger was showing Daniel a future in which faithfulness would cost everything, which the choice to remain loyal to God would mean choosing suffering and death over comfort and life. When they fell, the vision continued. They would receive a little help. Some would join them insincerely, attaching themselves to the resistance for reasons other than genuine faith. And some of the wise would stumble, would fall, would fail under the pressure. But even this would serve divine purposes, refining and purifying and making them white until the time of the end. For there was still an appointed time, a moment determined in the councils of heaven when the persecution would reach its limit and divine intervention would turn the tide. The king himself would do as he pleased, exalting himself and magnifying himself above every god. He would speak astonishing things against the God of gods, blasphemies that exceeded anything previous tyrants had uttered. Yet he would be successful only until the time of wrath was completed, for what had been determined would surely be done. His success had limits set by heaven. His blasphemies would be permitted only until they had served their purpose in the refining of God's people. The messenger described the king's character in terms that painted a portrait of comprehensive rebellion against everything sacred. He would show no regard for the gods of his ancestors or for the desire of women, a phrase that has puzzled interpreters for centuries, perhaps referring to the god Tammuz mourned by women, perhaps to natural human affections, perhaps to something else entirely. He would not regard any god, for he would magnify himself above them all. Instead of traditional deities, he would honour a god of fortresses, a deity of military power, lavishing gold and silver and precious stones upon this god unknown to his ancestors. He would attack the strongest fortresses with the help of this foreign god, advancing a strange worship that mingled military might with religious pretension. Those who acknowledged him would receive honour. He would make them rulers over many and distribute land as a reward. The fusion of political power and religious apostasy would create a system designed to crush dissent and reward collaboration. But then the vision shifted again, moving from the persecution to its end, from the time of suffering to the time of deliverance. At the time of the end, the king of the south would engage him in battle, and the king of the north would storm against him with chariots and horsemen and many ships. He would sweep through countries like a flood, entering the beautiful land, and tens of thousands would fall. Some would escape his hand, but he would extend his power over many countries, including Egypt. He would gain control of treasures of gold and silver with Libyans and Cushites at his heels. But reports from the east and north would alarm him, and he would go out with great fury to destroy and annihilate many. He would pitch his royal tents between the sea and the beautiful holy, mountained between the Mediterranean and Jerusalem, and yet he would come to his end, and no one would help him. The abruptness of that ending carried its own message. This king who had magnified himself above every god, who had persecuted the faithful with such ferocity, who had desecrated the temple and abolished the daily sacrifice, he would simply come to his end. No glorious final battle, no dramatic divine intervention described in detail. Just the flat statement that his end would arrive and no ally would save him. After all his scheming and conquering, after all the suffering he had inflicted and the blasphemies he had spoken, he would simply stop. Human tyranny, however terrible, was ultimately temporary. And then the messenger spoke words that lifted the vision beyond anything Daniel had yet heard, beyond the rise and fall of earthly kingdoms, beyond the immediate suffering of persecution, into a realm of hope that transcended death itself. At that time Michael shall arise, the great prince who stands watch over your people. Michael again, the chief prince who had helped the messenger break through, the resistance of the prince of Persia, the guardian of Israel in the heavenly places. At the culmination of history's darkest hour, when persecution reached its peak and all seemed lost, Michael would arise. The heavenly defender would stand, would act, would bring to bear the full weight of his celestial authority on behalf of the covenant people. And there shall be a time of trouble, such as never has been since there was a nation till that time. The words were stark, admitting no softening interpretation. What was coming would be worse than anything that had come before, worse than Egyptian slavery, worse than Babylonian conquest, worse than the persecutions the vision had just described. A tribulation unique in its intensity, unprecedented in human experience, the birth pangs of a new age arriving in agony. But at that time your people shall be delivered, everyone whose name shall be found written in the book. Deliverance would come, not for everyone indiscriminately, but for those whose names were written. A reference to the divine record, the book of life, the heavenly registry of those who belong to God. The faithful who had resisted, who had suffered, who had fallen by sword and flame, would not be abandoned to oblivion. Their names were known, recorded, preserved in ledgers that no earthly power could access or alter. And then came the revelation that would echo through all subsequent theology, the promise that later generations would recognize as the first clear statement of resurrection, hope in all the Hebrew scriptures. And many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting life, and some to shame and everlasting contempt. Daniel heard the words and felt the foundations of his understanding shift. Those who sleep in the dust, the dead, the departed, those whose bodies had returned, to the earth from which they were taken, they would awake. Death was not the end. The grave was not the final destination. Those who had fallen in persecution, those who had died for their faithfulness, those whose bones lay scattered in foreign soil or buried in ancestral tombs, they would rise. The awakening would not be universal in its outcome, even if universal in its scope. Some would rise to everlasting life, to existence beyond the reach of death, to joy without end in the presence of God. Others would rise to shame and everlasting contempt, to face judgment for their apostasy, their collaboration, their rejection of the covenant. The resurrection would be the great sorting, the final division between those who had remained faithful and those who had abandoned faith, between those whose names were written in the book and those who had erased themselves from its pages. And those who are wise shall shine like the brightness of the sky above, and those who turn a many to righteousness, like the stars forever and ever. The wise, those who had instructed many during the persecution, who had taught faithfulness at the cost of their own lives, who had turned others toward righteousness when the pressure to abandon righteousness was overwhelming, they would shine. not with reflected light, but with inherent glory, like the sky itself, like the stars that Daniel had watched from Babylonian rooftops for 70 years. The teachers of righteousness would become luminaries in the age to come, their reward proportionate to their sacrifice, their glory matching their faithfulness. Daniel stood in the fading light by the Tigris, his body trembling, his mind overwhelmed, his heart pierced by hope too large to fully contain. He had asked about his people's future and had been shown a suffering beyond imagination. But beyond the suffering lay resurrection. Beyond the persecution lay vindication. Beyond death itself lay life that never ended. The messenger had one more instruction before the vision closed. "But you, Daniel, shut up the words and seal the book until the time of the end. Many shall run to and fro, and knowledge shall increase." The revelation was not for Daniel's generation alone. It was to be preserved, sealed, kept safe for a future time when its meaning would become clear. The wise of later generations would search these words, would study and analyze and debate their significance, and in that searching, knowledge would increase. The book would remain partially mysterious until history itself provided the key to its interpretation. Daniel looked up from the overwhelming flood of revelation and saw two others standing by the river, one on this bank, one on the far bank. The scene had expanded beyond the single messenger, the heavenly witness multiplied, the testimony confirmed by additional presences. One of them asked the question that burned in Daniel's own heart. How long until the end of these wonders? The man in linen, still, central to the vision, raised both hands toward heaven and swore by him who lives forever that it would be for a time, times, and half a time. When the shattering of the holy people's power was complete, all these things would be finished. The answer was precise and mysterious at once, a formula that concealed as much as it revealed, pointing toward a duration that interpreters would debate for millennia. 3.5 times, a broken 7, a period that spoke of incompleteness, of tribulation cut short before it reached full measure, of divine limitation placed upon human suffering. Daniel heard but did not understand. The old prophet who had interpreted dreams for kings, who had read handwriting that baffled all Babylon's wise men, found himself confronting words whose meaning exceeded his grasp. And so he asked, with the humility that had characterized his entire prophetic career, "My Lord, what shall be the outcome of these things?" The answer would not be what he hoped for. The mysteries would remain mysteries, but the God who had sustained Daniel through a lifetime of exile would sustain him through this final uncertainty as well. The vision was closing, but its most personal moment was yet to come. The question hung in the air between the aged prophet and the glorious messenger. "My Lord, what shall be the outcome of these things?" It was the question of a man who had spent a lifetime interpreting mysteries for others, and now found himself confronting a mystery he could not penetrate. Daniel had explained dreams to Nebuchadnezzar, had read divine judgment on Belshazzar's wall, had received visions of beasts and statues and heavenly thrones. But this final revelation exceeded his capacity to fully comprehend. The pieces were before him: persecution, deliverance, resurrection, judgment. Yet the complete picture remained just beyond his grasp. The messenger's response was gentle but firm, carrying the tone of a teacher who knows that some lessons cannot be taught, only lived. "Go your way, Daniel, for the words are shut up and sealed until the time of the end. Go your way." The phrase carried multiple layers of meaning, each one settling into Daniel's consciousness like stones dropped into still water. It was permission to stop striving, to cease demanding answers that could not yet be given. It was acknowledgement that Daniel had done what he could, had received what was available, had pressed as far as human understanding could press. It was release from the burden of comprehending everything, an assurance that incomplete knowledge was not failure but simply the human condition. The words were sealed, not lost, not destroyed, not rendered meaningless by their obscurity. Sealed, preserved, protected for a future time when the seal would be broken and the meaning would become clear. Daniel was being told that his inability to understand was not a defect in the revelation, or a defect in himself. The revelation was, deliberately veiled, intentionally mysterious, designed to unfold across generations rather than in a single prophetic lifetime. What Daniel could not grasp, others would. What remained dark in his understanding would become light in theirs. The book would wait for its readers, and the readers would eventually arrive, until the time of the end. There was an appointed moment, a culmination toward which all history moved, a destination that gave meaning to the journey even when the journey seemed senseless. Daniel would not see that end. He would not live to watch the mysteries resolve into clarity, but the end would come nonetheless, and everything he had witnessed and recorded would find its fulfillment when the time was right. The messenger continued, offering not explanation but characterization of the era to come. Many shall purify themselves and make themselves white, and be refined, but the wicked shall act wickedly, and none of the wicked shall understand, but those who are wise shall understand. The future would be a time of sorting, of separation, of paths diverging. Some would respond to tribulation by allowing it to refine them, to burn away impurities, to produce a faith tested and proven. Others would respond to the same tribulation by hardening, by embracing wickedness, by confirming the trajectory they had already chosen. Understanding itself would become a function of character. The wise would perceive what the wicked could not because they were more intelligent, but because they were more faithful. The secrets of God would be revealed to those whose hearts were aligned with God's purposes and concealed from those whose hearts were set against him. Numbers were offered, thus in 290 days from the abolition of regular sacrifice to the setting up of the abomination of desolation, and thus 335 days to a blessing for those who waited and reached that number. Daniel heard the figures and knew that he could not calculate their meaning, could not plot them on a timeline that made sense of history's flow. They were markers, boundaries, promises that there would be an end to suffering, that those who endured would find blessing waiting on the other side. The specificity was itself a comfort, even without comprehension. God had counted the days. God had set the limits. Nothing would extend one moment beyond what divine wisdom had determined. Blessed is he who waits and arrives at the 335 days waiting. The word captured something essential about the life Daniel had lived and the lives that faithful people in every generation would be called to live, waiting for promises to be fulfilled, waiting for exile to end, waiting for persecution to pass, waiting for the resurrection that had been promised, waiting for the kingdom that the stone cut without hands would establish, waiting for God to act according to his own timing rather than human impatience. The blessing was not only for those who saw the fulfillment, but for those who waited for it, who held on through the darkness, who refused to abandon hope even when hope seemed foolish. And then the messenger spoke directly to Daniel himself, no longer describing future generations, but addressing the old prophet standing before him, trembling and overwhelmed and faithful to the last. But go your way till the end. Go your way. The phrase returned, but now with a different emphasis. Daniel had a way to go, a path still to walk, a life still to live, however many days or months or years remained to him. The vision was complete, the revelation was given, but the ordinary business of existence continued. There would be mornings to rise and evenings to rest, prayers to offer and meals to eat, conversations to have and duties to perform. The extraordinary encounter by the Tigris would give way to ordinary time, and Daniel was being commissioned to walk through that ordinary time with the same faithfulness that had characterized his entire life, till the end, his end. Not the end of history, not the end of the ages, but the end of Daniel's own journey through this world. The messenger was acknowledging what Daniel already knew. He was old, his days were numbered, the conclusion of his earthly story was approaching. But this acknowledgement came wrapped in comfort rather than dread. The end was not something to fear, but something to walk toward with dignity, with peace, with the assurance that ending in this world was not ending altogether. And you shall rest. Rest. After 70 years of exile, after decades of service in foreign courts, after visions that depleted his strength and revelations that overwhelmed his capacity, after prayers poured out for a homeland he would never see, and a people whose suffering would extend for generations. Rest. The word fell on Daniel's weary soul like water on parched ground. He would rest. The striving would cease. The burden would be laid down. The long faithfulness would give way to peace. The rest of the grave, some might say, the sleep of death that comes to all mortals. But the messenger had already spoken of those who sleep in the dust awakening, some to everlasting life. Daniel's rest would not be permanent unconsciousness, but temporary repose, a pause between the end of this life and the beginning of what lay beyond. He would rest, but the rest would have an ending just as life had an ending. What came after the rest would be something else entirely. And you shall stand in your allotted place at the end of the days. Stand. After the rest. Standing. After the sleep in the dust. Awakening. After death. Resurrection. The messenger was promising Daniel personally, individually, specifically, that the resurrection he had just heard described for the wise and the faithful would include him. He would not merely record the promise for others, he would participate in its fulfillment. At the end of the days, that mysterious culmination toward which all history moved, Daniel would stand. Not lie, not remain. In the dust, but stand, risen, restored, embodied once again, in your allotted place. The phrase suggested inheritance, portion, the division of land among the tribes that had structured Israelite identity since Joshua led them across the Jordan. Daniel had been denied his allotted place in the earthly promised land. He had never served in the temple that was his birthright as a priest. He had lived his entire adult life in exile, separated from the inheritance his ancestors had received. But at the end of the days, he would receive an allotted place that no exile could deny him, an inheritance that no foreign conqueror could confiscate, a portion in a kingdom that would never be divided or diminished. The promise was both an ending and a beginning. The vision closed with these words, the messenger's final communication to the prophet who had received so much. But the closing was itself an opening, a window into a future that extended beyond history into eternity, beyond the rise and fall of kingdoms into a kingdom that would not fall, beyond the succession of empires into an empire of the saints that would endure forever. Daniel stood by the Tigris as the vision faded, as the glory withdrew, as ordinary reality reasserted itself around him. His companions would eventually emerge from their hiding places, would find him standing alone by the river, would perhaps ask what had happened during the time of their terror-stricken flight. What could he tell them? How could words capture what he had experienced? The man in linen, the face like lightning, the voice like a multitude, the wars in heaven, the future of nations, the resurrection of the dead. It was too much, too vast, too far beyond ordinary experience to be easily communicated. But Daniel would try. He would return to his dwelling, would take up whatever writing materials were available, would set down as faithfully as he could the words he'd heard and the visions he had seen. The book would be sealed, but it would also be preserved, passed down through generations, studied and debated and cherished by those who came after. The wise who would shine like stars included not only those who taught during persecution, but those who recorded revelation for future ages. Daniel's act of writing was itself an act of teaching, of turning many to righteousness, of shining light into darkness that had not yet fallen. The old prophet made his way back from the river, his body still weak, his mind still reeling, his heart strangely at peace. He had lived to see Babylon fall, had served kings whose names would echo through history, had received visions that would shape the hopes of millions across millennia. Now he would live out whatever days remained, faithful to the last, trusting in promises he would not see fulfilled until he had passed through death and out the other side. The years that followed are not recorded. We do not know if Daniel saw another Passover, another Day of Atonement, another turning of the seasons in the land of his exile. We do not know if he received further visions or if the encounter by the Tigris was his last communication from heaven. We do not know the day or manner of his death, whether he slipped away peacefully in his sleep or succumbed to some illness of advanced age. The scriptures simply end, the book closes, and Daniel passes from the narrative into the silence that awaits all mortals. But the silence is not the end of his story. The messenger had promised, and God does not break his promises. Daniel would rest, but Daniel would also rise. At the end of the days, when the great Prince Michael stands up for his people, when the resurrection separates the faithful from the faithless, when those who are wise shine like the brightness of the sky, Daniel will stand in his allotted place. The old prophet will be old no longer, the exile will finally be home. The vision of the man in linen carries forward through the centuries, its mysteries slowly yielding their secrets as history unfolds. The persecution of Antiochus came and passed. The Maccabees rose and fought and purified the temple. Other persecutions followed. Roman destruction, centuries of diaspora, horrors that Antiochus could not have imagined. And still the faithful waited. Still the wise instructed many. Still the book of Daniel was opened and studied and pondered by those who longed for the end of days. The promise of resurrection that Daniel received became the hope of Israel, debated by Pharisees and Sadducees, affirmed by Jesus when he spoke of the dead rising, vindicated when he himself rose from the tomb on the third day. The first clear statement of resurrection hope in Hebrew scripture became the foundation for everything that followed, the assurance that death did not have the final word, that those who slept in the dust would awaken, that everlasting life awaited those whose names were written in the book. And the figure Daniel saw by the Tigris, the man clothed in linen, with face like lightning and eyes like fire, whose voice was like the sound of a multitude, that figure would appear again. When John the Apostle received his revelation on the island of Patmos, he saw one like a son of man, clothed in a robe reaching to his feet, with a golden sash around his chest, his eyes like a flame of fire, his voice like the roar of many waters. The resonance was unmistakable. What Daniel glimpsed, John saw more fully. The man in linen was preparing Daniel for an encounter that later generations would recognize as an encounter with the Son of God himself. The message to Daniel echoes still to all who find themselves waiting for promises not yet fulfilled, enduring trials not yet ended, trusting in a future not yet visible. Go your way. The words are sealed until the time of the end. You shall rest, and you shall stand in your allotted place at the end of the days. Heaven fights for the faithful, even when the faithful cannot see the stop warfare. Unseen princes contend over earthly kingdoms, and Michael stands guard over the people of God. Prayers are heard from the first day they are uttered, even when answers are delayed by conflicts in the invisible realm. The silence of heaven is not absence but battle, not indifference but engagement on a scale that human minds can barely comprehend. God holds the future, the rise and fall of empires, the persecution and deliverance of his people, the suffering of the faithful and the judgment of the wicked. All of it moves according to a plan that will reach its appointed end. Nothing is wasted. Nothing is meaningless. Even the mysteries that cannot be understood are part of a story that will one day make perfect sense, when the sealed book is opened and the wise shine like stars forever. Daniel rests now, has rested for 25 centuries, waiting for the end of the days. But the promise remains, unbroken and unbreakable. He will stand, he will receive his inheritance, the old prophet who walked with kings and outlived empires, who faced lions and flames and the hostility of the powerful, who prayed toward a Jerusalem he would never see and received visions he could never fully understand. He will stand at last in the presence of the one whose face is like lightning, whose eyes are like fire, whose voice is like the sound of many waters, and so will all who go their way in faith, trusting the words that are sealed, resting in promises not yet fulfilled, waiting for the resurrection that will make all things new. Go your way, rest, and at the end of the days, rise.